My fiance's daughter spent years testing me to prove I was worthy of their family. Now she's the one who has to beg for my help. When I started dating Paul, he was upfront about having a 16-year-old daughter named Ashley, who was protective of him after her mom left. I understood and took things slow, letting Ashley set the pace for our relationship. For the first year, everything seemed fine. Ashley was polite if distant, and I respected her boundaries. When Paul proposed after 2 years, Ashley said she was happy for us, but needed to make sure I was worthy of being her stepmother. I thought she meant she wanted to spend more time together, get to know me better. I didn't realize she meant actual tests with scores and consequences. The first test happened the week after our engagement. Ashley handed me a 20-page questionnaire about Paul's life. His favorite foods, his allergies, his work history, his college friends' names, his shoe size, his mother's maiden name, everything. She said a real wife should know these things and gave me 1 hour to complete it. I got 70% and Ashley said that was barely passing. She posted a chart on the refrigerator tracking my score. Paul thought it was funny that Ashley was being so thorough. The second test was cooking. Ashley said her dad deserved someone who could make his favorite meals perfectly. She had me cook dinner every night for a month and rated each meal out of 10. If I scored below 7, she'd throw the food away and order pizza, telling Paul I'd failed again. She'd sit at the table with a notebook writing detailed criticism while I served everyone. Paul said she was helping me improve. The tests got more extreme. She'd call me at work with emergencies to see how fast I'd drop everything for family. She'd leave messes around the house, then time how long it took me to notice and clean them. She'd tell me fake stories about Paul's past to see if I'd believe them, or knew him well enough to spot lies. She had a spreadsheet tracking every test with color-coded results. When I complained to Paul, he said Ashley was working through her abandonment issues, and testing meant she cared. The worst was the loyalty test. Ashley's friend Maya pretended to be a coworker, and messaged me saying Paul had been flirting with her at a work event. It was elaborate, with photoshopped pictures and fake text conversations. Ashley wanted to see if I'd trust Paul or believe the evidence. When I confronted Paul, confused and hurt, Ashley jumped out recording everything and said I'd failed the trust test. She played the recording for Paul's family at Sunday dinner, saying I didn't have faith in him. Paul's mother asked Ashley what was wrong with her, and Ashley said she was protecting her father from another woman who'd leave. For my birthday, Ashley gave me a binder labeled Improvement Plan, with all my test failures highlighted and goals for getting better scores. She'd included study materials about Paul's life and practice scenarios for future tests. Paul thought it was thoughtful that she'd put so much work into helping me. I was exhausted and humiliated, but Paul kept saying Ashley would warm up once I proved myself. The breaking point was Ashley's college interview season. She was applying to competitive schools and needed recommendation letters and interview prep. She demanded I help since a good stepmother would support her education. I agreed, thinking maybe this would help us bond. I spent weeks coaching her for interviews, editing her essays, driving her to campus visits. Then Ashley announced her final test. I had to get her into her dream school, Whitfield College, or I'd proven I wasn't worthy of joining the family. She said a real mother would do anything to help her child succeed. If she got rejected, the wedding was off. Paul didn't contradict her. The Whitfield interview was scheduled for December 10th. Ashley had me drive her 3 hours there, wait outside for 2 hours, then drive back. She came out smiling, saying it went perfectly. But something felt off about her confidence. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about it. I called Whitfield the next morning, pretending to confirm Ashley's interview time for scheduling purposes. The admissions office said Ashley never showed up for her interview on December 10th. They'd tried calling, but she didn't answer. They'd marked her as a no-show and removed her from consideration. I checked our car's GPS history. We'd driven to Whitfield, but Ashley had me drop her at the coffee shop down the street, not the admissions building. She'd sat there for 2 hours instead of interviewing, planning to blame me when she got rejected for missing it. I didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered. Instead, I called Whitfield back from Ashley's phone that I'd borrowed while she was at school. I apologized profusely for missing the interview, explaining there'd been a family emergency. I begged for another chance. The admissions officer was hesitant, but agreed to a video interview that Friday. I coached Ashley harder than ever that week, making sure she was perfect. She didn't know about the rescheduled interview. Friday came and went. Monday morning, Ashley announced at breakfast that Whitfield would be sending decisions soon, and reminded everyone that my worthiness depended on her acceptance. Paul nodded seriously. 2 weeks later, the email came while we were all at dinner. Ashley opened it dramatically, ready to blame me for her rejection. Her face went white. Her face went white. She kept her eyes on the phone screen, scrolling up and down like she needed to check the email was real. Paul leaned over from his chair, trying to see what had her frozen, and when he read the first line, his whole face lit up. He grabbed Ashley's shoulder and shook it, laughing, asking why she wasn't celebrating. I sat across the table with my coffee mug in both hands, watching them. Ashley looked up from the phone and her eyes found mine immediately. Her mouth opened a little, then closed. She looked confused, like she was trying to work out a math problem that didn't make sense. I took a sip of coffee and kept my face calm. Paul pulled Ashley out of her chair and wrapped her in a hug, talking fast about how proud he was. He said something about all her hard work paying off, about how he knew she could do it. Ashley stood there with her arms at her sides for a second before she hugged him back. She was still staring at me over his shoulder. Her eyes were narrow, suspicious. I smiled and said congratulations, keeping my voice warm and genuine. Paul finally let her go and she looked down at her phone again, reading the email one more time. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closed it. Paul started talking about calling his parents, about how they'd be so excited. Ashley said she needed to go call her friends with the good news. Her voice came out shaky. Paul was too busy being happy to notice. He kissed the top of her head and told her to go ahead. I watched Ashley walk toward the stairs. She moved slowly, like her legs weren't working right. At the bottom step, she turned and looked at me again. I gave her another smile and picked up my coffee mug, taking another sip. She went upstairs and I heard her bedroom door close. Paul was already pulling out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. I stood up and started clearing the breakfast dishes from the table. The plates clinked together as I stacked them. Paul didn't notice me moving around. He was too busy calling his mother. I could hear him talking as I walked to the sink, his voice loud and excited. He said Ashley got into her dream school. He said she worked so hard for it. He didn't mention me at all. I turned on the water and started rinsing the plates. Paul talked for 10 minutes, then called his brother. Same conversation, same excitement. I loaded the dishwasher and wiped down the counters. He never once mentioned that Ashley had told him the wedding was off if she got rejected. Never brought up how this acceptance was supposed to be my final test. I finished cleaning and poured myself more coffee. Paul was still on the phone, now talking to his father. I leaned against the counter and listened to him brag about his brilliant daughter. The word brilliant came up 3 times. The phrase so proud came up 5 times. My name didn't come up once. After an hour, he finally put his phone down. He looked at me and smiled big, like he wanted me to share his happiness. I smiled back and said it was wonderful news. He agreed and started talking about how this meant Ashley would be happy now, how she'd finally accept me as part of the family. I nodded and said I hoped so. He kissed my cheek and went to his office to do some work. I stayed in the kitchen, drinking my coffee. Ashley came back downstairs 2 hours later. Her eyes were red and puffy. She'd been crying or maybe just thinking really hard. She walked into the kitchen and stood by the table looking at me. I was reading something on my phone, acting normal. She asked if I knew about the acceptance already. Her voice was tight, controlled. I looked up and said no, the email just came this morning. I asked why I would know before her. She stared at me for a long moment. I kept my face confused, innocent. She said she just wondered. I asked if something was wrong. She said no and went back upstairs. Over the next 3 days, Ashley watched me constantly. She'd walk into whatever room I was in and just stand there, staring. At dinner, she barely ate, just kept looking at me across the table. Paul didn't notice. He was too busy planning Ashley's future, talking about dorm rooms and class schedules. Ashley would bring up the interview randomly. She'd ask what I remembered about the drive there. I'd tell her we drove 3 hours. I dropped her at the campus. I waited in the car. She came back after 2 hours. All true. She'd ask what building I saw her go into. I'd say I couldn't remember exactly. I was checking my email while she walked away. Also true, since she went to the coffee shop and I was in the car. She'd ask if I talked to anyone while waiting. I'd say no, I just sat in the car. True again. She couldn't catch me in a lie because I wasn't lying. I just wasn't telling her everything. On the 4th day, I went to my closet and pulled out 3 years' worth of calendars and notebooks. I'd been keeping records without really planning to. Every time Ashley gave me a test, I wrote it down. The dates, the scores, what she said, what Paul said. I had the cooking scores from that month where she rated every meal. I had notes about the emergency calls, the exact times, and what she claimed was wrong. I had the quiz about Paul's life with my 70% score. I had everything written down in my own handwriting. I spread it all out on my bed and looked at it. 3 years of being evaluated and scored and judged. 3 years of trying to prove I was good enough. I took photos of every page with my phone, then put everything back in the closet. I wasn't sure why I needed photos yet, but I knew I did. Paul noticed I was quieter than usual. He asked if something was wrong. I told him I was just tired from work. He accepted that easily, the way he always accepted simple explanations. He never dug deeper, never asked follow-up questions. He just nodded and went back to whatever he was doing. I realized he'd been doing that for 3 years, taking the easy answer so he didn't have to look at anything complicated. Tuesday morning, Paul left for work early. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Ashley came downstairs. She didn't say good morning. She walked right up to me and asked if I called the school. Her voice shook. I turned to look at her and asked what she meant. She said, "Whitfield, did I call them?" I asked why I would call her college. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She couldn't explain without telling me she'd planned the whole thing. She couldn't accuse me of fixing her interview without admitting she'd sabotaged it first. I watched her struggle. Her face went red, then white. Her hands were shaking. She finally said she just wanted to understand the timeline of events. I told her sometimes admissions offices make mistakes with scheduling. I said maybe there was a mix-up on their end. I kept my face calm, just mildly interested in solving her confusion. She stared at me. I could see her trying to figure out if I was playing dumb or if I really didn't know. I poured my coffee and asked if she wanted some breakfast. She said no and walked out of the kitchen. I heard her go back upstairs and close her door hard. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to shut off my brain. Every test played through my mind on repeat. The cooking scores where Ashley threw away my food while Paul sat there nodding. The emergency calls during work meetings that made my boss question my commitment. The fake stories about Paul's ex-girlfriends to see if I'd believe lies. But the trust test was the worst. Ashley's friend pretending to be a coworker, sending me fake evidence of Paul flirting at a work event. Those photoshopped pictures looked so real. I'd been shaking when I confronted Paul, my voice breaking as I asked if he was cheating. Then Ashley jumped out with her phone recording everything, laughing as she announced I'd failed. She played that video at Sunday dinner while everyone watched me sob on screen. Paul's whole family saw me at my most vulnerable, watched me doubt the man I loved, all because his daughter engineered it. And Paul had laughed, called it creative problem solving. Never once acknowledged that his daughter had deliberately broken my heart as a test. He'd helped her plan it. He told me that last week like it was nothing. Like setting up elaborate scenarios to hurt me was just good parenting. I got up at 6 without sleeping. My phone was already in my hand before I really thought about it. I called Celine and she answered on the second ring, her voice rough with sleep. I told her everything. The missed interview, the GPS history showing Ashley at a coffee shop instead of the admissions building, how I'd called Whitfield and rescheduled without telling anyone. Celine was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said she was proud of me for finally fighting back. Her voice was fierce. She reminded me of the mess test, how Ashley had deliberately knocked over a plant and timed how long it took me to notice and clean it up. 37 minutes, because I'd been helping Paul with work emails. Ashley had written the time on her chart like I was a maid being evaluated. Paul had been watching football the whole time, not helping, just letting his daughter treat me like hired staff in my own home. Ashley started acting different the next day. She smiled at me over breakfast and asked if I wanted coffee. Her voice was sweet, concerned. She offered to help make dinner that night, something she'd never done without it being a test. She asked about my day at work with this fake interest that made my skin crawl. The testing had been awful, but at least it was honest. This niceness was worse because I could see her brain working behind her eyes, trying to figure out what I knew. She kept bringing up Whitfield casually, mentioning how surprised she was by the acceptance, asking if I thought admissions offices ever made mistakes. I just smiled and said sometimes things work out in unexpected ways. She stared at me like she was trying to read my thoughts. Paul's mom called on Thursday while I was at work. I stepped outside to take it. She wanted to congratulate Ashley and said how relieved she was that all that testing nonsense was finally over. I stopped walking, asked her what she meant. There was a pause. Then she admitted she'd always thought Ashley's behavior was concerning. She'd told Paul multiple times that the tests were unhealthy, that making me prove myself constantly wasn't normal family bonding. Paul had insisted it was healthy boundary setting, that Ashley needed to protect herself after her mom left. This was the first time anyone in Paul's family had said out loud that something was wrong. 3 years of tests and humiliation, and Paul's own mother had known it wasn't okay. She'd just never said anything to me. Catherine suggested we meet for coffee. Just the two of us. I agreed, and we met Saturday morning at a place near her house. She hugged me when I arrived, and I almost started crying right there. She told me she was worried about how much I'd changed since the engagement. She said I used to laugh more, seem lighter, like I enjoyed life. Now I looked tired all the time, stressed, like I was constantly waiting for the next test. I hadn't noticed. I'd been so focused on passing Ashley's evaluations that I stopped paying attention to myself. I'd lost weight, stopped seeing my friends as much, gave up hobbies because Ashley needed help with college applications, or Paul wanted me home for family dinners. I'd been shrinking myself to fit into their family and didn't even realize how much of me had disappeared. Ashley announced Monday night that she needed help with scholarship applications. She had a stack of them on the kitchen table when I got home from work. She handed me a timeline with deadlines highlighted, told me which nights I needed to be available to edit essays. Not asked. Told. Like I was her employee and she was setting my schedule. I agreed because I wanted to see where this went. But this time I noticed everything. The way she phrased things as demands. The expectation that my time belonged to her. The assumption that I'd drop everything to help without question. She acted like my help was owed to her. Like I existed to serve her needs. We worked on essays Wednesday night. Ashley's laptop was open on the table between us. She got up to get water and her screen was still lit. I saw a group chat open, messages scrolling. My name caught my eye. I leaned forward and read fast. Ashley's friends were talking about me. One message called me desperate and pathetic. Another made jokes about how I'd do anything to marry her dad, probably because I couldn't find anyone else. There was speculation about what test Ashley should create next, suggestions getting more cruel. Someone said Ashley should test if I'd lie for her. Another said she should see how much money I'd spend trying to impress them. Ashley had responded with laughing emojis, adding her own ideas about future tests. They were treating my life like entertainment. My hands were shaking, but I pulled out my phone and took photos of the screen. 3 pictures capturing different parts of the conversation. Ashley's footsteps were coming back down the hall. I put my phone away and my face went blank. Neutral. She sat back down and I continued editing her essay like nothing happened, suggesting ways to strengthen her introduction. My voice was steady while my heart pounded. I was adding this to my collection of evidence, building a file without really knowing what I'd do with it. But I needed proof. Needed documentation of what she really thought of me. Paul came home an hour later and asked how the scholarship work was going. Ashley told him I was being so helpful, really supportive. She smiled at me and I smiled back. Both of us performing for him like actors in a play. He looked pleased, said he was glad we were finally bonding. He couldn't see the tension between us, the way Ashley's smile didn't reach her eyes, or how my jaw was clenched tight. He just saw what he wanted to see. His daughter and his fiancé getting along. Everything working out exactly how he'd always said it would if I just proved myself worthy. Michael came over for dinner Saturday. Paul's brother had always been polite but distant, not getting involved in family drama. After we ate, he pulled me aside in the kitchen while Paul and Ashley were in the living room. He asked if I was really okay with everything that had happened over the past few years. His voice was quiet, serious. I was surprised he was being so direct. He said he'd always thought Ashley's testing was manipulative and wrong, but Paul wouldn't hear criticism of his daughter. Michael had tried talking to Paul twice, suggesting the tests were unhealthy. Paul had shut him down both times, said Michael didn't understand because he didn't have kids. So Michael had stayed quiet and watched me get smaller and sadder. He looked guilty about it now, like he regretted not speaking up sooner. I told Michael I appreciated him finally saying something. He looked uncomfortable but said he couldn't stay quiet anymore, that watching me shrink over the years made him feel like he was part of the problem. We talked for another 20 minutes before Paul came back into the kitchen, and Michael changed the subject smoothly to work. I went upstairs after dinner and opened my laptop while Paul was watching television downstairs. I typed "emotional abuse in relationships" into the search bar and started reading. The first article described patterns I recognized immediately. Constant criticism disguised as helpful feedback. Moving goalposts where you can never quite succeed no matter how hard you try. Isolating you from support systems by convincing you that your concerns are overreactions. Making you feel like you have to earn basic respect and consideration. Every paragraph felt like someone had been watching my life for the past 3 years and writing it down. I clicked through to another article about gaslighting and my hands started shaking. The article explained how abusers convince victims that their perception of reality is wrong, that reasonable reactions are unreasonable, that clear mistreatment is actually love or protection. Paul had done exactly this, telling me Ashley's tests meant she cared, that I was too sensitive when I complained, that her behavior was normal for a protective daughter. He'd reframed every cruel action as something I should be grateful for. I spent 2 hours reading while Paul slept next to me, the laptop screen lighting up the dark bedroom. I found articles about family systems where one person's dysfunction is enabled by everyone else's silence. Articles about children who manipulate their parents and the parents who can't see it because of guilt or fear. Articles about partners who choose their children over their spouses in ways that destroy relationships. Everything described my situation so perfectly, it felt like those writers knew Paul and Ashley personally. I closed the laptop at midnight and lay in the dark thinking. Paul had manipulated me just as much as Ashley had, just in different ways. He'd convinced me that enduring abuse was proof of my commitment, that speaking up about mistreatment meant I didn't really love him. He'd made me responsible for fixing a problem he refused to acknowledge existed. The next morning, Ashley announced at breakfast that she wanted to do something special for Paul and me. She said she'd been thinking about family dynamics and wanted to see how I handled blending our families together. She wanted me to host a dinner with my parents and sister along with Paul's family, and she'd evaluate how I managed everyone's different personalities and needs. She smiled while explaining this, her voice sweet and reasonable. Paul thought it was a great idea, a chance for everyone to get closer before the wedding. I agreed to host the dinner, keeping my face neutral. Ashley looked pleased, probably already planning how she'd engineer conflicts and score my performance. But I was planning something too, something she wouldn't expect. I spent the rest of that day thinking about who I could trust. My sister Sophia had always been protective of me growing up, and I'd barely talked to her about what was happening with Paul and Ashley. I'd kept most of it secret, partly because Paul convinced me it was normal, and partly because admitting the truth felt too humiliating. I called Sophia that evening when Paul took Ashley to her friend's house. I told her I was hosting a family dinner next weekend and asked if she could come. She said of course, then asked if everything was okay because my voice sounded strange. I took a breath and told her I needed to talk to her about some things that had been happening, that I'd been keeping quiet about problems in my relationship. Sophia went silent for a moment, then asked me to tell her everything. I spent 40 minutes describing the tests, the constant evaluation, the ways Ashley had humiliated me while Paul watched and approved. I told her about the cooking scores and thrown away meals, the emergency calls timing my responses, the loyalty test recording played at family dinner. I explained how Paul always defended Ashley, how he'd helped plan some of the tests, how he convinced me this was all normal and I was overreacting. Sophia's voice got tighter and angrier as I talked. She asked why I never told anyone before, why I'd been dealing with this alone for 3 years. I realized I didn't have a good answer. Paul had isolated me so gradually I hadn't noticed it happening. He'd made me feel like my concerns were invalid, like speaking up about Ashley's behavior meant I was a bad person who didn't understand family loyalty. He'd convinced me that if I just tried harder and proved myself more thoroughly, everything would get better. Sophia said she was coming to the dinner and she'd make sure Ashley didn't get away with whatever she was planning. I felt relief wash over me. The first time in years that someone was clearly on my side without conditions or qualifications. I invited my parents too, and my mom asked if there was any particular reason for the dinner. I said I just wanted everyone to get together before the wedding, which was technically true. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening. I spent the week preparing, cooking Paul's favorite foods the way Ashley had taught me to make them. Ashley watched me work in the kitchen Friday night, taking notes in her little book. She asked questions about the menu and how I planned to seat everyone, clearly already scoring me on decisions I hadn't even made yet. Paul seemed excited about the dinner, talking about how nice it would be to have both families together. Saturday came and everyone arrived within 20 minutes of each other. My parents hugged me and Sophia gave me a long, hard look that said she was watching everything carefully. Paul's parents arrived next and Michael came with them. Ashley greeted everyone with perfect politeness, playing the role of sweet stepdaughter. We sat down to eat and I watched Ashley start her work. She asked my mom about her job, then mentioned something Paul had told her about my mom's career struggles when I was young. My mom looked surprised that Ashley knew those details, and Ashley smiled, saying a good family shares everything. Then she turned to my dad and asked about his health, bringing up a heart condition he'd had 10 years ago in a way that made it sound current and serious. Paul's parents looked concerned, and my dad had to explain it was old news and he was fine now. Ashley was creating worry and confusion, making my family look either secretive or dramatic depending on how they responded. Sophia caught what was happening immediately. She smoothly changed the subject, asking Paul's father about his woodworking hobby and getting him talking about a project. Ashley tried to interrupt twice, but Sophia kept redirecting, protecting the conversation from Ashley's attempts to derail it. I watched my sister work and felt grateful in a way I hadn't felt in years. She was doing for me what Paul should have been doing, recognizing manipulation and shutting it down instead of enabling it. Ashley shifted tactics, asking my sister about her divorce in a sympathetic voice that somehow made it sound shameful. Sophia smiled and said her divorce was the best decision she ever made, that leaving a bad situation took courage. She looked directly at me while saying it, and I knew she was sending me a message. Ashley's face tightened slightly, but she kept smiling. The dinner continued with Ashley making subtle digs and Sophia deflecting them. My parents started noticing the pattern, the way Ashley would ask seemingly innocent questions designed to expose problems or create tension. Paul didn't see any of it, laughing and talking like everything was going great. Michael noticed, though, and I caught him watching Ashley with a frown several times. After everyone left, Paul put his arm around me and said the dinner went really well. He thought both families got along great, and Ashley seemed impressed with how I handled everything. I asked him if he noticed Ashley trying to start arguments or make people uncomfortable. Paul looked confused, saying he didn't know what I meant. I described several specific moments, the questions about my mom's career and dad's health, the comment about Sophia's divorce. Paul said those were just normal getting-to-know-you questions, that I was reading too much into friendly conversation. I realized he genuinely couldn't see what Ashley was doing even when I pointed directly at it. He'd been blind to her manipulation for so long that his brain couldn't process it as manipulation anymore. He saw a loving daughter making conversation, not a calculating person engineering conflict. I went to bed that night knowing I needed outside help, someone who could see the situation clearly without years of conditioning. I met Sean at a coffee shop near his office the next afternoon. He looked uncomfortable when I sat down, fidgeting with his cup and not making eye contact right away. I asked him why he was telling me all this now, about Paul's ex-wife leaving because of Ashley. Sean took a long breath and said he'd been watching me for 3 years, seeing how I changed. He said Paul used to talk about how happy he was when we first started dating, how I made him laugh and feel young again. But lately when Sean saw me, I looked tired all the time, like I was carrying something heavy that kept getting worse. He said he valued Paul's friendship more than almost anything, but he couldn't watch another person get destroyed by Ashley's need for control. His words made my throat tight because someone finally saw what was happening, really saw it, and didn't tell me I was being too sensitive or needed to try harder. Sean said he hoped I didn't hate him for staying quiet so long, but he couldn't live with himself if he didn't speak up now. I told him I didn't hate him, that his honesty made me feel less crazy than I'd felt in years. We sat there for a while not saying much, and for the first time since the engagement I felt like someone was on my side without conditions or tests. The next evening, Ashley announced at dinner that she'd been planning a surprise for the engagement party. Paul looked excited and asked what kind of surprise. Ashley pulled out her phone and started scrolling through a guest list, reading names I'd never heard before. Paul's cousins from Oregon, his aunt and uncle from Florida, college friends he hadn't seen in years, extended family I didn't even know existed. She'd invited 40 people without asking me, planned the whole party at some venue downtown she'd already booked. Paul asked about the menu, and Ashley rattled off food choices she'd made, decorations she'd ordered, a timeline for the evening. She showed us pictures of the venue on her phone, a fancy place with high ceilings and crystal lights. Paul put his arm around Ashley and told her this was so thoughtful, that she'd really outdone herself. He looked at me and said, "Wasn't it sweet that Ashley was taking so much initiative with the wedding planning?" I forced a smile and said it was very thoughtful. Ashley watched me with that calculating look she got when she was testing something, waiting to see if I'd complain or push back. I saw it clearly now, how she was taking control of our engagement party the same way she'd taken control of everything else, putting me on display for a crowd of strangers who'd evaluate me based on whatever story Ashley fed them first. Paul couldn't see it, just kept praising Ashley for being so helpful and caring about our celebration. 2 days later, I called Whitfield's admissions office from my car during lunch break. I asked to speak with someone about an interview that had been rescheduled back in December. The receptionist transferred me, and a woman's voice came on the line introducing herself as Olivia Livingston. I explained that I was Ashley's future stepmother, and wanted to verify some details about the interview process for our family records. Olivia's voice stayed professional but friendly, asking what specifically I needed to know. I said I wanted to confirm the timeline of Ashley's interview, when it was originally scheduled and when it actually happened. Olivia pulled up Ashley's file and told me the original interview had been scheduled for December 10th, but Ashley never showed up. They'd marked her as a no-show and called several times but got no answer. Then someone called from Ashley's phone on December 11th apologizing and begging for another chance, explaining there'd been a family emergency. Olivia said she normally didn't reschedule no-shows, but the person on the phone had been so upset and sincere that she agreed to a video interview that Friday. Ashley had done very well in that interview, which was why she'd been accepted. I thanked Olivia and asked if she could send me any documentation of that timeline for our records. Olivia said she'd be happy to send an official summary of the admissions process. The email from Olivia arrived the next morning with a professional summary attached. It listed both interview dates, the no-show notation, the rescheduling call, and the video interview completion. Everything was there in official Whitfield letterhead, proof that Ashley had deliberately sabotaged herself and that I'd saved her acceptance without anyone knowing. I printed 3 copies and put them in my folder with all the other documentation. This was the final piece of evidence I needed. The thing that would prove Ashley's manipulation wasn't just mean behavior, but calculated schemes designed to destroy me. I sat at my desk staring at the email, thinking about how Ashley had planned to blame me for missing an interview she never intended to attend. She would have stood in front of Paul and his family and said I'd failed her, that I wasn't worthy of joining their family, all while knowing she'd sabotaged herself. The cruelty of it made my hands shake. That weekend, Paul mentioned casually over breakfast that he'd been thinking about some of Ashley's tests. I looked up from my coffee and he was smiling like he was remembering something funny. He said he knew about some of the more elaborate ones, like that trust test with the fake coworker. My stomach dropped and I asked what he meant by knew about them. Paul said he'd actually helped Ashley plan that one because he wanted to see how I'd react under pressure, if I'd trust him or believe fake evidence. He laughed a little and said Ashley had been so creative with those photoshopped pictures. The way he talked about it was so casual, like he was describing a harmless prank instead of a cruel setup that left me crying in front of his whole family. I felt something crack inside my chest, some last piece of hope I'd been holding on to that Paul had been blind to what Ashley was doing. He'd known, he'd participated, he'd watched me break down and thought it was reasonable. I put my coffee down carefully and asked Paul what other tests he knew about. He thought for a moment and started listing them like he was recounting fond memories. The timed emergency calls where Ashley would fake crises to see how fast I'd drop everything, he'd suggested that one. Some of the household mess scenarios where she'd deliberately make disasters for me to clean up. He'd known about those and thought they were good practice for family life. The questionnaire about his life, he'd helped Ashley write some of the questions. He said he'd been protecting his daughter and teaching me to be a better partner at the same time. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, like this was completely normal behavior. He genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong, that this was reasonable vetting for someone joining their family. I asked him if he thought it was okay to engineer situations designed to make me fail and cry. Paul looked confused and said he never wanted me to fail. He just wanted to make sure I was strong enough to handle their family dynamics. He said Ashley had been through so much with her mom leaving, and he needed to know I wouldn't abandon them too. That night, I packed a bag while Paul was watching television downstairs. I moved quietly, taking clothes and toiletries and my folder of documentation. When I came down with my bag, Paul looked up surprised and asked where I was going. I told him I needed a few days at Celine's to think about some things. His face shifted from surprise to confusion to hurt. He asked what he did wrong, why I was leaving so suddenly. I said I needed space to process everything that had happened, that I couldn't think clearly while living in his house under Ashley's constant evaluation. Paul stood up and said we could talk about whatever was bothering me, that leaving wasn't necessary. I told him it was necessary for me, that I needed time away to figure out what I wanted. He asked how long I'd be gone, and I said I didn't know yet. Ashley appeared at the top of the stairs, watching us with those calculating eyes. She asked if everything was okay, and I said it was fine. I just needed some time to myself. Paul reluctantly agreed to let me go, though he looked hurt and confused. Ashley watched me leave with an expression I couldn't quite read, probably wondering if this was the beginning of the end she'd been working toward for 3 years. Celine opened her apartment door and pulled me inside without asking questions. I dropped my bag and went straight to her couch, spreading out all my documentation across the coffee table. The timeline of tests, the screenshots of Ashley's group chat, the email from Whitfield, 3 years of systematic degradation laid out in organized files. Then I started crying, really crying for the first time in months. Celine sat next to me and put her arms around me while I sobbed into her shoulder. I talked through everything, every test and humiliation, and moment where Paul had were chosen Ashley's feelings over my dignity. Celine listened without interrupting, just holding me and letting me get it all out. When I finally stopped crying, she asked me what I wanted to happen now. The question caught me off guard because I'd spent so long focused on surviving and proving myself that I hadn't thought about what I actually wanted. I realized I wanted Paul and Ashley to face the truth of what they'd done, to see it clearly without excuses or justifications. I wanted them to understand how much damage they'd caused, even if it cost me the relationship. Celine nodded and said that was a good starting point for figuring out my next move. I spent 3 days at Celine's apartment making a decision about my future. I called my parents on the second day and told them everything I'd been hiding for 3 years. My mom cried on the phone and my dad's voice got tight with anger. They were horrified they hadn't seen what was happening, hadn't noticed how much I'd changed. My dad offered to come get me immediately, to bring me home where I'd be safe. I told him I appreciated that, but I needed to handle this myself. I'd spent 3 years trying to be worthy of Paul's family, jumping through every hoop and passing every test they invented. Now I needed to prove to myself that I was worth more than their evaluation system, that I deserved better than conditional acceptance based on scores and performance reviews. My mom asked if I was going to break up with Paul, and I said I didn't know yet, that I needed to see if he was capable of understanding what he'd done. She said she'd support whatever I decided, but that she hoped I'd choose myself for once. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day. Paul called multiple times asking when I was coming home. I listened to his voicemails pile up, his tone shifting from confused to annoyed to worried. The first messages were casual, asking if I was feeling better and when I'd be back. Then they got frustrated, saying he didn't understand why I was being so dramatic about needing space. By the third day, his voice sounded genuinely worried, asking if he'd done something specific to upset me and begging me to just talk to him. I didn't answer most of the calls, just let them go to voicemail while I sat on Celine's couch thinking. Ashley texted me once on the second day asking if this was about the engagement party planning. She said she could include me more in decisions if I was feeling left out, that she didn't mean to take over completely. Her message showed she had no idea what was actually wrong, no understanding that the problem went deeper than party planning. She thought I was upset about not being consulted on decorations and venues, completely missing that I was done being tested and evaluated and controlled. Her misunderstanding of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. This girl who'd spent 3 years analyzing my every move couldn't see that she'd finally pushed me too far. I drove back to the house on Thursday afternoon, my car loaded with the bag I'd packed at Celine's and a folder of printed documents sitting on the passenger seat. Paul's truck was in the driveway when I pulled up, and I saw him appear at the front door before I'd even turned off the engine. He hurried down the steps toward me, his face showing relief mixed with worry. He reached for my bag, but I held onto it, needing to carry my own things after 3 days of thinking about what I was carrying emotionally. We walked inside together, and I set my bag down in the entryway, turning to face him in the living room where everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left. Paul started talking immediately, asking if I was okay and saying he'd been worried sick. I held up my hand and told him we needed to have a serious conversation, my voice calm and steady in a way it hadn't been in years. He nodded quickly, relief flooding his features at the prospect of fixing whatever was wrong. I told him I wanted to have a family meeting with him, Ashley, and his parents present to talk about some things before the wedding. His eyebrows drew together in confusion, and he asked what kind of things. I said we needed to discuss our family dynamics honestly, all of us together in one room. He agreed immediately, probably thinking I wanted to clear the air about wedding planning or maybe address some minor tension with Ashley. He pulled out his phone right there and started texting his parents, asking about their availability for a family dinner. I watched him coordinate the meeting with the same efficiency he brought to work projects, completely unaware of what I was actually planning to say. Paul scheduled the dinner for the following Sunday at his parents' house, giving everyone a week to prepare. Ashley came home from a friend's house that evening and found me unpacking my bag in the bedroom. She stood in the doorway watching me hang up clothes, her posture tense. She asked what the family meeting was about, her voice tight with something that sounded like suspicion. I turned to face her and told her it was time we all talked honestly about our family dynamics before the wedding, that we needed to have some real conversations about how we interact with each other. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she asked what I meant by that. I kept my tone calm and pleasant, saying just that we should all be on the same page about expectations and communication. She didn't like my calm tone. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened. She pressed for more details, but I smiled and said we'd discuss everything on Sunday when everyone was together. She left my room looking unsettled, and I heard her go downstairs to find Paul. Their voices drifted up through the floor, Ashley's higher and faster than usual, but I couldn't make out the words. I finished unpacking and laid out my folder of documentation on the closet shelf, checking that all the pages were in order. The next few days passed in careful preparation. I called Celine on Friday and asked if I could come over to practice what I was going to say. She opened her door and pulled me into a hug, then settled us both on her couch with tea. I pulled out my folder and walked through the timeline of tests, explaining how I planned to present each one. Celine listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious as I described the cooking evaluations and the loyalty test recording. She asked how I was feeling about confronting everyone, and I told her I felt strangely calm, like I'd finally found solid ground after years of shifting sand. She offered to come with me for moral support, to sit in the car outside or wait at a nearby coffee shop. I thanked her but said this was something I needed to do alone, that I needed to face Paul's family by myself to prove to myself I could. We spent 2 hours going through everything, with Celine asking questions that helped me clarify my points. She reminded me to breathe and to stick to facts rather than emotions, to present the evidence and let it speak for itself. I practiced describing each test in a calm, factual tone until the words felt natural. Before I left, I printed out extra copies of my documentation at her apartment. The timeline of tests filled 3 pages with dates and descriptions. The screenshots of Ashley's group chat messages where she mocked me to her friends printed onto 2 pages. The email from Whitfield Admissions showing the original no-show and rescheduled interview took 1 page. I put everything in a folder and drove home feeling more prepared than I'd felt in 3 years. Saturday night, the evening before the family meeting, Ashley tried one more manipulation. We were all in the living room after dinner, Paul watching television while I read a book. Ashley came and sat next to Paul on the couch, her body language small and worried. She told him she was concerned about me, that I'd seemed really unstable lately. Paul muted the television and turned to look at her with immediate concern. Ashley continued, saying maybe the wedding stress was too much for me, that I'd been acting strange since I got back from Celine's. She suggested maybe I needed to see someone professional, that she was worried about my mental health. Paul turned to look at me with worry creasing his forehead, asking if I was okay. I set down my book and met his eyes, telling him I was fine and actually feeling clearer than I had in a long time. I said I was looking forward to our family conversation tomorrow, that it would be good to have everything out in the open. Ashley's face tightened and she opened her mouth to say something else, but I smiled at her pleasantly and asked if she was nervous about the meeting. She closed her mouth and shook her head, saying she just wanted to make sure everyone was okay. I told her everyone would be fine, that honest conversations were healthy for families. Paul looked between us, clearly sensing tension, but unable to identify its source. He asked again if I was sure I was okay, and I reassured him I was perfectly fine, just ready to talk openly about some things that had been bothering me. Ashley excused herself and went upstairs, and I picked up my book again while Paul unmuted the television. Sunday morning arrived, and Ashley made one final attempt to control the situation. She came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and announced she'd been thinking about the wedding planning. She said it was clear I couldn't handle the pressure of planning everything, that I seemed overwhelmed and stressed. She framed it as concern, saying she wanted to help me by taking over the wedding planning entirely. She said she'd handle all the decisions about the venue, the flowers, the catering, everything. It would take the burden off my shoulders, and Paul came into the kitchen and heard her offer, his face lighting up with approval. He said that was really generous of Ashley, that it would be great if she could help out more. I poured my coffee slowly, letting them both finish talking. Then I turned and smiled at Ashley, telling her that sounded like a wonderful idea. She could absolutely take over the wedding planning if she wanted to. Both Ashley and Paul looked surprised by my easy agreement. Ashley's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly suspicious of why I wasn't fighting her for control. I kept my expression pleasant and told her I appreciated her wanting to help, that she should feel free to make whatever decisions she thought were best. Paul beamed and said how great it was that we were working together as a family. Ashley looked less pleased despite getting what she wanted, studying my face like she was trying to read a code. I finished my coffee and went upstairs to get ready for the dinner, leaving them both in the kitchen looking confused by my calm acceptance. I spent the afternoon getting ready with careful attention. I chose a simple blue dress that Paul's mother had complimented before, nothing too formal but respectful for a family dinner. I did my makeup carefully and pulled my hair back in a neat ponytail. The folder of documentation sat on my bed, and I checked through it one more time to make sure everything was in order. Every page was there, every piece of evidence organized chronologically. I put the folder in a large purse that could hold it without bending the papers. Paul knocked on the bedroom door around 4 and said he and Ashley were getting ready to leave, asking if I wanted to ride with them. I told him I'd drive separately since I had some errands to run afterward. He looked disappointed but accepted it, saying they'd see me there. I waited until I heard his truck pull out of the driveway before I got in my own car. The drive to his parents' house took 20 minutes, and I spent it breathing deeply and reviewing what I was going to say. I imagined Ashley in Paul's truck, probably trying to figure out what I was planning, maybe coaching Paul on how to handle whatever I might bring up. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that I'd spent 3 days organizing years of evidence into an undeniable timeline. I pulled up to Paul's parents' house and saw Paul's truck already parked in the driveway, along with another car that belonged to Paul's brother. I grabbed my purse with the folder inside and walked up to the front door. Paul's mother, Catherine, answered before I could knock, pulling me into a tight hug. She held me for a moment longer than usual, then pulled back and looked at my face. She whispered that she was glad I called this meeting, that it was overdue. Her words surprised me and gave me strength at the same time. She led me inside where everyone was gathered in the dining room. Paul's father, Dexter, stood by the table talking with Paul. Ashley sat in a chair looking tense, her phone in her hands. Paul's brother, Michael, was there too, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Everyone turned to look at me when I entered, and I felt the weight of their attention. Paul came over and kissed my cheek, asking if everything was okay. I told him everything was fine and took a seat at the table, setting my purse carefully on the floor beside my chair where I could reach it easily. We sat down to dinner and made small talk for the first 15 minutes while Catherine served food. Ashley kept glancing at me, trying to read my expression. Paul seemed relaxed, probably thinking this was just going to be a pleasant family discussion about wedding plans or household dynamics. Dexter asked about work, and I answered politely, keeping my responses brief. Michael caught my eye once and gave me a small nod that felt like encouragement, though I wasn't sure if he knew what was coming. After everyone had food on their plates, Dexter set down his fork and asked what this was all about, why I'd requested this family meeting. I took a breath and said I wanted to talk about the past 3 years, and what's really been happening in our family. Ashley interrupted immediately, her voice rising as she said everything had been fine, and she didn't know what I was talking about. Catherine held up her hand and told Ashley firmly to let me speak, that I'd called this meeting and deserved to be heard. Ashley's mouth snapped shut, but her face flushed red. Paul looked confused, glancing between me and his daughter. I kept my voice calm and steady, saying I wanted to walk everyone through some specific things that had happened since Paul and I got engaged. I started by describing the first test with the 20-page questionnaire about Paul's life, how Ashley had given me 1 hour to complete it and then scored it. I explained how Ashley had posted my grade on the refrigerator, a chart tracking my worthiness as Paul's future wife. Paul's parents exchanged glances across the table, and Michael shifted his weight uncomfortably against the wall. Ashley jumped in defensively, saying it was just a fun way to bond, that she was trying to get to know me better. I nodded and said I understood that's how it might have seemed, but then I continued describing what came next. I told them about the cooking test, how Ashley had me prepare dinner every night for a month and rated each meal out of 10. I described how she'd throw away any meal that scored below 7 and order pizza instead, telling Paul each time that I'd failed. Catherine's hand went to her mouth and Dexter's eyebrows drew together. Paul started to speak, but I held up my hand gently, asking if I could finish before we discussed it. He nodded slowly, his face showing the first hints of real concern. I went through the timeline methodically, describing the timed emergency calls where Ashley would test how fast I'd drop everything at work. I explained the household messes she'd leave deliberately, timing how long it took me to notice and clean them. I described the fake stories about Paul's past that she'd tell me to see if I'd believe them, or know him well enough to spot the lies. With each example, I watched Paul's parents' faces grow more serious. Then I described the loyalty test in detail, the one that still made my stomach hurt to remember. I explained how Ashley's friend Maya had pretended to be a coworker, messaging me with claims that Paul had been flirting with her at a work event. I described the photoshopped pictures and fake text conversations, how elaborate the whole setup had been. I told them about confronting Paul, confused and hurt, and how Ashley had jumped out recording everything. I explained how she'd declared I'd failed the trust test, and played the recording for everyone at Sunday dinner, presenting it as evidence that I didn't have faith in Paul. The table was completely silent now. Paul had gone pale and I could see him remembering that dinner, probably seeing it differently now. Catherine's eyes were wet, and Dexter looked angry in a way I'd never seen before. Michael had pushed off from the wall and taken a seat at the table, leaning forward with his elbows on the surface. Ashley tried to interrupt again, saying I was making it sound worse than it was, but Catherine told her sharply to be quiet and let me finish. I continued describing the birthday present, the binder labeled improvement plan, with all my test failures highlighted and goals for getting better scores. I explained how Paul had thought it was thoughtful that Ashley had put so much work into helping me improve. I watched Paul's face as I said this, saw him processing these events through a new lens. I described the college application help, the weeks of coaching and essay editing, and then Ashley's final ultimatum that I had to get her into Whitfield College, or the wedding was off. I described the college application help, the weeks of coaching and essay editing, and then Ashley's final ultimatum that I had to get her into Whitfield College, or the wedding was off. Ashley jumped up from her chair, her voice getting loud and defensive as she tried to interrupt, saying I was making everything sound worse than it really was, that I was exaggerating and taking things out of context. Paul shifted in his seat, his face showing discomfort, but his mouth opening to defend Ashley like always, starting to say she was just being protective of him after her mother left. I held up my hand, palm out, and told him firmly that I wasn't finished speaking, my voice steady and strong in a way it hadn't been in 3 years of living under Ashley's evaluation system. The room went quiet again, and I could see Paul close his mouth, his expression uncertain as he looked between me and his daughter. I reached into my folder and pulled out the printed screenshots of Ashley's group chat messages, the ones I'd photographed from her laptop screen weeks ago. I passed the papers around the table slowly, making sure everyone got a copy to read for themselves. Catherine took hers with trembling fingers and started reading, her eyes moving across the mocking descriptions Ashley had written about me, the jokes about the tests being hilarious, the speculation with her friends about what would finally make me leave Paul. I watched Catherine's free hand come up to cover her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she read her granddaughter's cruel words. Michael leaned forward to read over Dexter's shoulder, his jaw tightening as he saw Ashley's messages calling me desperate and pathetic, her detailed plans for future tests to humiliate me further. Paul took the paper from Dexter and started reading, his face going from tan to pale white as he processed the words his daughter had written. He looked up at Ashley, his eyes searching her face, and asked if this was real, if she'd actually written these things about me to her friends. Ashley scrambled to explain, her words coming out fast and panicked, saying it was just venting to friends like everyone does, that people complain about their family members all the time and it didn't mean anything serious. But the cruelty in the messages was right there in black and white, undeniable proof of the calculated nature of her manipulation laid out for everyone to see. The jokes about timing my emergency responses, the bets with friends about how low she could score my cooking before I gave up, the satisfaction she expressed when the trust test recording made me cry at family dinner. Michael pushed back from the table and stood up, walking to the window with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders tense with anger. I took a breath and told them about Whitfield, about how Ashley had deliberately missed her interview on December 10th and planned to blame me for her rejection. I described calling the admissions office the next morning to confirm the appointment time, finding out Ashley had been marked as a no-show, checking our car's GPS history, and discovering she'd had me drop her at the coffee shop down the street instead of the admissions building. I explained how she'd sat there for 2 hours instead of interviewing, setting up the perfect scenario to declare I'd failed her final test when the rejection letter came. Ashley's face went from white to deep red, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she started to stand up from her chair. I kept talking, describing how I'd called Whitfield back from Ashley's phone, apologizing for the emergency that caused her to miss the interview, begging for another chance. I told them about the video interview that Friday, how I'd coached Ashley harder than ever that week to make sure she was perfect, how she'd done the interview without even knowing it had been rescheduled. I reached back into my folder and pulled out the email from Olivia Livingston at Whitfield Admissions, the official documentation showing the original December 10th no-show and the rescheduled video interview date. Ashley lunged across the table for the paper, but Michael moved fast, stepping away from the window to block her and take the email from my hand to read it himself. The official Whitfield letterhead proved everything, showed in formal administrative language that Ashley had sabotaged her own college application to frame me, and that I had saved her acceptance to her dream school without telling anyone what I'd done. Michael read the email out loud, his voice hard, detailing the missed appointment, the family emergency explanation, the accommodation of a video interview, the subsequent acceptance based on that rescheduled interview performance. Dexter stood up and took the email from Michael, reading it again himself while shaking his head slowly. Ashley's careful control shattered completely. She screamed that I had no right to interfere with her test, that it wasn't my place to call her college behind her back, her voice going high and breaking. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands, her knuckles white, and told her father that the whole point of the test was to prove I couldn't get her into her dream school, that I was supposed to fail so everyone would see I wasn't good enough to be part of their family. The words poured out of her in her anger, a full confession to years of deliberate sabotage and manipulation, admitting she'd designed every test knowing I couldn't pass, that the scoring system was rigged from the start. She told Paul directly that I was never supposed to be good enough, that no score would have been high enough, that the entire 3 years of testing had been about proving to him that I should leave like her mother did. The room went completely silent after Ashley's confession, nobody moving or speaking for what felt like a full minute. Paul stared at his daughter like he was seeing a stranger, like the person standing in front of him wasn't the girl he'd raised and protected and made excuses for. Catherine was crying quietly into her hands, her shoulders shaking, and Dexter looked more angry than I'd ever seen him, his face red and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Michael walked back to the table and sat down heavily in his chair, looking at me with something like respect mixed with sadness. He asked me directly how long I'd known about the Whitfield situation, his voice gentle compared to the tension in the room. I told him I found out the day after the supposed interview when I called to confirm the appointment time, that I'd known for weeks that Ashley had sabotaged herself. I explained that I chose to help her anyway, to reschedule the interview and coach her to success, because I thought she deserved her education and her future, regardless of what she'd done to me over the past 3 years. Paul finally spoke, his voice rough and quiet, asking me why I didn't tell him about any of this when I found out. I looked at him directly across the table and reminded him that I had tried to tell him things, multiple times over 3 years, and he'd always defended Ashley instead of listening to me. I brought up the specific conversation 2 months ago, where he'd admitted he helped Ashley plan the trust test with the fake coworker, how he'd thought it was clever problem-solving to test my faith in him. I told him he'd been helping his daughter manipulate me for years, actively participating in her schemes, choosing to enable her behavior rather than parent her or set any boundaries. I described how every time I came to him upset about a test or a score or a humiliation, he'd explained it away as Ashley working through her abandonment issues, making me feel guilty for being hurt by his daughter's cruelty. Ashley spun toward Paul, her voice turning accusing as she told him he was supposed to protect her, that he should be on her side against me. She said he'd promised her mother would never be replaced, that they were supposed to be a team, that he'd failed her by not defending her now when she needed him most. Paul looked torn, his face showing the battle between his love for his daughter and the undeniable evidence of what she'd done spread across the table in screenshots and official emails. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his hands reaching toward Ashley then dropping back to his sides. Catherine stood up from her chair and told Ashley firmly that what she'd done was cruel and completely wrong, that testing someone's worth for years wasn't love or protection, it was calculated harm. She said Ashley had hurt someone who'd only ever tried to be kind to her, someone who'd endured humiliation and manipulation, and still helped her get into college when she didn't deserve that kindness. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, and told them I was done being evaluated and scored like a test paper. I looked at Paul and told him I loved him, but I couldn't marry into a family where I was constantly on trial, where his daughter's need for control mattered more than my basic human dignity. I said that if he wanted any kind of future with me, things had to change completely and permanently, starting with him acknowledging out loud his role in enabling and participating in Ashley's behavior for 3 years. I told him he'd helped plan tests designed to humiliate me, he'd laughed at my failures, he'd dismissed my hurt feelings, and he'd chosen his daughter's manipulation over my well-being every single time I'd asked for help. I grabbed my purse and walked toward the door, my legs steady even though my heart pounded. Paul caught up with me on the front porch, the cold night air hitting both of us as the door closed behind him. Ashley's crying was muffled now, just background noise to whatever came next. He reached for my arm, but I stepped back, needing space between us. His face looked different somehow, like seeing him clearly for the first time without the filter of wanting him to be better than he was. He said my name quietly, then again when I didn't respond. I crossed my arms and waited, watching him struggle to find words that wouldn't sound like more excuses. He apologized then, really apologized, his voice breaking on the words in a way I'd never heard before. He said he was sorry for everything, for every test he let happen, for every time he chose Ashley's manipulation over my feelings. The apology kept coming, specific details about moments I thought he'd forgotten or never cared about in the first place. He mentioned the trust test recording, the cooking scores, the questionnaire on the refrigerator, each memory making his voice shakier. He told me he was terrified of losing Ashley the way he lost her mother, that the fear made him blind to what was actually happening. He admitted he knew some of Ashley's tests were cruel, but convinced himself it was temporary, that she'd eventually accept me and everything would be worth it. He said he kept telling himself it would get better, that Ashley just needed more time, more proof, more something he could never quite define. The words sounded honest, but they also sounded like explanations, reasons why he'd let 3 years of abuse happen under his roof while calling it family bonding. I let him finish before I spoke, my voice calm and clear in the cold air. I told him his fear didn't excuse what happened, that his guilt about Ashley's mother leaving wasn't my burden to carry. I said every time I came to him hurt or confused, he made me feel like the problem, like I was too sensitive or didn't understand family dynamics. I reminded him he helped plan the trust test, that he laughed at my test scores, that he thought the improvement plan binder was thoughtful instead of cruel. I told him he chose to be Ashley's enabler instead of her parent, and he chose to be her partner in manipulation instead of mine in building a life together. I said I needed him to choose now, clearly and completely, to be my partner instead of Ashley's backup in whatever scheme came next. I told him I was going to stay at Celine's apartment for a while, that I needed space to think without his presence or Ashley's tests clouding my judgment. I said if he wanted any kind of future with me, he needed to decide if he was willing to set real boundaries with his daughter, boundaries that actually meant something instead of suggestions he'd abandon the moment Ashley cried. I told him we needed family therapy together, Real therapy with a professional who could see manipulation for what it was, not more excuses about abandonment issues justifying abuse. I said I'd been making myself smaller for 3 years trying to fit into their broken family dynamic, and I was done shrinking. He nodded slowly, tears on his face, but I couldn't tell if he really understood, or if this was just another moment he'd explain away later. I walked to my car without looking back, drove to Celine's apartment and cried for 2 hours straight while she held me, and didn't say I told you so even though she'd been telling me for years. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange blur of normal work days and emotional phone calls. Paul called every single day, sometimes twice, leaving messages when I didn't answer. I listened to each voicemail before deciding whether to call back, hearing the progression in his voice from desperate to determined. He told me he started individual therapy with someone specializing in family dynamics and enabling behavior. He described his first session where the therapist asked him to list times he'd protected me from Ashley instead of protecting Ashley from consequences, and he couldn't name a single instance. He said he'd been having hard conversations with Ashley about her behavior, really confronting her instead of smoothing things over. He told me Ashley moved back to her mother's house temporarily because the tension at home was too much for either of them to handle. He said his mother, Catherine, had been calling him daily, refusing to let him backslide into old patterns of excusing Ashley's cruelty. He mentioned his father, Dexter, finally spoke up about concerns he'd had for years but never voiced, about how Ashley controlled every family gathering and Paul let her. He told me about crying in his therapist's office when he realized he'd been choosing his fear over my well-being for 3 years straight. Each call felt a little different, a little more honest, but I didn't know yet if honest was enough to fix what was broken. My email notification chimed on a Thursday morning while I was getting ready for work at Celine's apartment. Ashley's name appeared in my inbox and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. The email was long, several paragraphs that started defensive and angry. She wrote that I had no right to interfere with her college process, that calling Whitfield was an invasion of her privacy. She said I'd manipulated the situation to make myself look good, that I'd stolen her acceptance by rescheduling without permission. The accusations continued for 3 paragraphs, each one blaming me for different things. But then the tone shifted, the anger giving way to something that looked like actual vulnerability. She admitted she was terrified of being abandoned again, that watching her mother leave destroyed something in her she didn't know how to fix. She wrote that she tried to control everything with me because control felt safer than trust, that if she could prove I wasn't good enough then it wouldn't hurt when I eventually left. She said she understood if I never forgave her, that she'd done things that couldn't be taken back or explained away. She told me she was starting therapy to work on her fear and manipulation, that her mother insisted on it as a condition of living there. The apology wasn't perfect, still had defensive moments and justifications mixed in, but it felt real in a way nothing from Ashley ever had before. I read it 3 times before closing my laptop, not ready to respond, but not ready to delete it either. Paul asked me to meet him for coffee the following week, and I agreed, choosing a neutral cafe neither of us had been to before. He arrived early and stood when I walked in, his face hopeful and scared at the same time. We ordered drinks and sat by the window, the afternoon sun making everything feel too bright and exposed. He told me he was committed to changing, that his therapist was helping him see patterns he'd been blind to for years. He said he was horrified by what he'd allowed to happen, by how many times he'd dismissed my pain or laughed at my humiliation. He described watching the video his mother took of the family dinner confrontation, seeing Ashley's confession and his own torn expression, understanding finally how much damage his enabling had caused. He told me he wanted to marry me, but understood if I needed more time or if I decided I couldn't. He said he wasn't pressuring me or trying to rush my decision, just being honest about his feelings and his commitment to doing better. He showed me a list his therapist had him make of specific boundaries he needed to set with Ashley, concrete actions instead of vague promises. He asked if I'd be willing to try couples therapy together, to work through everything with professional help instead of just hoping things improved. His hands shook slightly holding his coffee cup, and I realized he was genuinely afraid of losing me. Not just afraid of being alone, but specifically afraid of losing what we could have been if he'd chosen differently 3 years ago. I'm still staying at Celine's apartment, my clothes in her guest room, my routine adjusted to someone else's space. Paul and I talk regularly now, careful conversations where we're both trying to be honest instead of just trying to win. We started couples therapy last week, sitting in uncomfortable chairs while a patient woman asked us questions that made both of us squirm. Paul is following through on boundaries with Ashley, telling her no when she tries to dictate terms for their relationship, insisting she respect both of us if she wants him in her life. Ashley is still at her mother's house, working with her own therapist, sending occasional emails that are getting slightly less defensive each time. I don't know yet if the relationship is salvageable, if 3 years of damage can be undone, or if we're just delaying an inevitable ending. Some days I think about the life we could have if Paul really changes, if Ashley really grows, if we could build something healthy from these broken pieces. Other days I think about how much easier it would be to start over with someone who never made me feel like I needed to earn basic respect. But for the first time in 3 years, I'm making decisions based on what I need instead of what I need to prove. I'm learning to value myself again, to recognize that love shouldn't require passing tests or accepting cruelty disguised as protection. I'm figuring out what I actually want instead of just trying to survive what someone else demands. Whether or not Paul and I end up together, whether Ashley ever truly understands the harm she caused, I'm choosing myself now. That choice feels powerful in a way nothing has felt in years, like reclaiming something I didn't realize I'd lost until I started finding it again.